Today, we read delving into a dark and often overlooked chapter of history, the system of forced labor in Angola under Portuguese colonial rule. Join us as we uncover the truth behind this colonial practice. To understand the roots of forced labor in Angola, we need to go back to the late 19th century. Specifically to the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. This was when European powers carved up Africa amongst themselves, and Portugal was determined to solidify its control over its claimed territories, including Angola. Portugal's colonial project was driven by economic ambitions. The colony needed to be profitable. To achieve this, a vast labor force was required for plantations, mines, and the construction of infrastructure like roads and railways. The problem was, how could they compel the local Angolan population to work for little to no pay, especially after slavery was officially outlawed? The answer was a series of legal frameworks that institutionalized forced labor, or chibolo, as it was known. The cornerstone of this system was the Native Labor Code of 1899. This law was a masterpiece of colonial hypocrisy. It declared that all natives had a moral and legal obligation to work. If an Angolan man could not prove he was gainfully employed according to the colonial administration standards, he was classified as idle. This idleness was considered a crime. Once deemed idle, a man could be legally conscripted by the state and forced to work for private companies or on public works projects. The process was systematic and cruel. Colonial administrators, known as chefs de posto, worked with local chiefs who were often coerced or bribed into providing a quota of laborers. Men were rounded up from their villages, often violently, and taken far from their homes and families. They were forced into contracts that they couldn't read and didn't understand, binding them to work for months, sometimes even years. Conditions for these forced laborers were horrendous. They worked from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, performing grueling physical tasks. Their housing was often nothing more than crowded, unsanitary barracks. Food was scarce and of poor quality, leading to widespread malnutrition and disease. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Beatings and physical punishment were common, with overseers using whips, known as the chicote or palmatoria, to enforce discipline and terrorize the workers. The mortality rate was shockingly high. Many men died from exhaustion, disease, or workplace accidents, never to see their families again. This constant removal of able-bodied men had a devastating impact on their home villages. It disrupted family structures, destroyed local economies, and left communities in a perpetual state of poverty and grief. Women, children, and the elderly were left to fend for themselves, struggling to cultivate land and maintain their households. This system was particularly notorious on the coffee, sugar, and cotton plantations in northern Angola and on the cocoa plantations of São Tomé and Príncipe, another Portuguese colony to which many Angolans were forcibly transported. These servicais, as they were called, were essentially slaves. Their contracts were often indefinitely renewed, and the chances of returning home were slim. The journey itself was perilous, and once on the islands, they were trapped in a cycle of debt and brutal labor. The international community wasn't entirely silent. In the early 20th century, British journalist Henry Nevinson and reformer Joseph Burt exposed the horrors of the São Tomé labor system. Their reports sparked an international outcry, leading to a boycott of São Tomé cocoa by major chocolate manufacturers like Cadbury. However, despite this pressure, the Portuguese government made only superficial changes, and the core of the forced labor system remained intact for decades. Why did this system persist for so long? Firstly, it was incredibly profitable for the colonial state and for Portuguese companies. The cheap, coerced labor was the engine of the colonial economy. Secondly, it was justified by a racist ideology. The Portuguese colonialists viewed Africans as inherently lazy and uncivilized, believing that forced labor was a necessary tool to civilize them and teach them the value of work. This paternalistic and deeply racist belief was used to legitimize immense cruelty. Thirdly, the system was a powerful tool of social control. By keeping the Angolan population subjugated, impoverished, and dispersed, the colonial administration could suppress dissent and prevent organized resistance. Resistance, however, did occur. Throughout the colonial period, there were numerous forms of defiance. Some people fled their villages to escape recruitment, hiding in the bush or seeking refuge in neighboring territories. Others engaged in small-scale acts of sabotage at their workplaces. Over time, this simmering resentment and opposition grew into a more organized and powerful force. The brutal reality of forced labor was a major catalyst for the rise of nationalist movements in Angola in the 1950s and 60s. Leaders and intellectuals who had witnessed or experienced the horrors of Chibolo began to organize, demanding an end to colonial rule. The memory of this exploitation fueled the struggle for independence. When the Angolan War of Independence broke out in 1961, it was, in many ways, a direct response to decades of violent oppression and forced labor. The Portuguese government finally abolished the system in the early 1960s, but it was too little, too late. The fight for freedom had begun. Angola finally achieved independence in 1975, but the legacy of forced labor continues to cast a long shadow. Generations were traumatized. The system entrenched economic inequalities and social divisions that have persisted long after the colonialists left. The destruction of local economies and social structures created challenges that the newly independent nations struggled to overcome, challenges that were compounded by a long and devastating civil war. Understanding the history of Chibolo is crucial. It reminds us that the end of legal slavery did not mean the end of slave-like practices. It reveals the hypocrisy at the heart of the civilizing mission and exposes the brutal economic logic of colonialism. It is a history that was intentionally obscured for many years, but one that must be told and remembered, not only to honor the millions of victims but also to understand the complex realities of Angola today. Thank you so much for joining me for this important discussion. The story of forced labor in Angola is a difficult but necessary one to learn. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into history. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video.